It was April of 1970. The Vietnam War had been raging for more than 11 years. Hopes were high that the unpopular war would soon be coming to an end, as President Richard M. Nixon had been promoting the Vietnamization of the war, promising to replace U.S. troops with newly trained South Vietnamese soldiers. But on April 30th, 1970, President Nixon announced the U.S. would invade Cambodia. This announcement renewed the anti-war movement, and protests increased as many across the country reacted with shock and anger that an already distrusted president had lulled the country into a false sense of hope and relief that this conflict would be ending and that American soldiers would be coming home. A renewed sense of anger and discontentment was spreading across the country, and nowhere would this be more apparent than in sleepy Kent, Ohio, where a monumental event was brewing. Kent State University, located in northeastern Ohio, was about to become the focal point of the anti-war movement. On May 1st, 1970, with protests already raging at universities across the country, a group of approximately 500 Kent State students gathered at a grassy knoll in the center of campus to rally against the war. Protesters issued a call to bring the war home as a graduate student burned a copy of the U.S. Constitution and another burned his draft card. This protest ended without incident as most students dispersed to attend 1 p.m. classes, with another rally planned for May 4th. Trouble began to brew, though, as around midnight, students leaving bars in downtown Kent and an area known as the Strip began throwing beer bottles at cars and breaking downtown storefronts as a spontaneous, alcohol-fueled anti-war rally began in the street. Passing police cruisers were hit with beer bottles, and political targets such as banks, loan companies, and a utility company were damaged by the rioters. Kent Mayor Leroy Satcham declared a state of emergency and called Ohio Governor Jim Rhodes' office requesting that assistance be sent and ordered all bars closed. A dusk to dawn curfew was imposed on the city and students were restricted to campus facilities. The following day, another demonstration broke out on the Commons, but ended less peacefully as the campus ROTC building was set ablaze and firefighters responding were pelted with rocks and had their hose cut. The previous day, when Kent Mayor Leroy Satcham had called Governor Jim Rhodes, Satcham requested that the Ohio National Guard be deployed on campus, a request which Rhodes would grant, but the Guard would not arrive until 10 p.m., well after the protests had begun and the ROTC building set ablaze. Armed with tear gas and drawn bayonets, the Guard pursued students, protesters, and bystanders alike into dormitories and other campus buildings. Kent State University was now fully occupied by the Ohio National Guard. On Sunday, May 3rd, during a press conference at the Kent Firehouse, an emotional Governor Rhodes pounded on the desk and called the student protesters un-American, referring to them as revolutionaries set on destroying higher education in Ohio. We've seen here at the city of Kent especially, probably the most vicious form of campus-oriented violence yet perpetrated by dissident groups. They make definite plans of burning, destroying, and throwing rocks at police and at the National Guard and the Highway Patrol. This is when we're going to use every part of the law enforcement agency of Ohio to drive them out of Kent. We're going to eradicate the problem. We're not going to treat the symptoms. At 8 p.m. that evening, another rally was held and was only dispersed with the announcement of a new curfew, the reading of the Ohio Riot Act, and tear gas canisters dropped from hovering helicopters. At 11 a.m. the next day, about 200 students gathered on the Commons. As noon approached, the size of the crowd had grown to 1,500. Some were merely spectators, while others had gathered specifically to protest. The students were told to disperse immediately, but responded with jeers and chants. When the students refused to disperse, the guardsmen were told to disperse them. Approximately 116 National Guardsmen, equipped with loaded M1 rifles and tear gas, formed a skirmish line towards the students. Aware of bayonet injuries from the previous evening, students immediately ran away from the attacking National Guardsmen. The guard, after clearing the commons, marched over the crest of the hill, firing tear gas and scattering the students into a wider area. The guard then continued marching down the hill and onto a practice football field where they held position for 10 minutes as tear gas canisters were lobbed back and forth from the guard's position to a small group of students in the Prentice Hall parking lot more than 100 yards away. The vast majority of students, however, were spectators on the veranda of Taylor Hall. While on the practice field, several members of Troop G, which would within minutes fire the fatal volley, knelt and aimed their weapons at the students in the parking lot. General Robert Canterbury concluded that the crowd had been dispersed and ordered the guard to march back to the commons area. Some members of Troop G then huddled briefly. After reassembling on the field, the guardsmen seemed to retreat as they marched back up the hill, retracing their previous steps. Members of Troop G, while advancing up the hill, continued to glance back to the parking lot where the most militant and vocal students were located. The students assumed the confrontation was over. Many began to walk to their next classes. As the guard reached the crest of Blanket Hill near the pagoda of Taylor Hall, about a dozen members of Troop G simultaneously turned 180 degrees, aimed and fired their weapons into the crowd in the Prentice Hall parking lot. A total of 67 shots were fired in just 13 seconds from the high-powered M1 Garand rifles once used to fight the Nazis. 4 students, Allison Cross, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Schauer, and William Schrader, were killed. 9 students were wounded. Of the wounded, 1 was permanently paralyzed, and several were seriously maimed. All were full-time students. The fallout from the Kent State shootings was widespread and only led to further campus protests, causing more than 450 campuses across the country to close with both violent and nonviolent demonstrations. 5 days after the shootings, more than 100,000 people demonstrated in Washington, D.C. against both the war and the killing of unarmed student protesters. President Nixon was taken to Camp David for 2 days for his own protection, and the military was called up to protect the administration from the angry students. The Nixon administration initially reacted to this event with wanton insensitivity. Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler, referred to the deaths as a reminder that when dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy. Nixon himself had talked of bums destroying U.S. campuses, to which the father of Allison Cross stated on national TV, "My child was not a bum." A Gallup poll taken immediately after the shootings showed that 58% of respondents blamed the students, 11% blamed the National Guard, and 31% expressed no opinion. In response to the Kent State shootings as well as the shootings at Jackson State, President Nixon established the Scranton Commission, which he charged to study the dissent, disorder, and violence breaking out on university campuses across the nation. The commission issued its findings in a September 1970 report that concluded that the Ohio National Guard shootings on May 4, 1970 were unjustified. The report concluded that the shootings by the guardsmen were unjustified and that going forward there must never be a situation in which loaded rifles are issued to guardsmen facing student protesters. 8 of the guardsmen were indicted by a grand jury. The guardsmen claimed to have fired in self-defense, a claim that was generally accepted by the criminal justice system. In 1974, U.S. District Judge Frank Battisti dismissed all charges against all 8 on the basis that the prosecution's case was too weak to warrant a trial. Civil actions were also attempted against the guardsmen, the state of Ohio, and the president of Kent State University. After court rulings and reversals, the plaintiffs were finally awarded a settlement of $675,000 to be split equally, and the defendants were required to publicly state their regret over what transpired. Over the years, new information has led to numerous conspiracy theories about guardsmen planning to fire upon protesters and other such backroom dealings. The original prosecutor in the case was even overheard saying that the guardsmen should have killed all the troublemakers. Much of the who did what in the events that fateful day are still and will likely forever be unknown, but what is known is that 4 young lives were ended tragically and unnecessarily that infamous day in May 1970. This is undoubtedly one of the great injustices of the 20th century, and one which is still carried today in the hearts and minds of justice-loving Ohioans and pervade in the spirit of the modern anti-war movement.